The Pokemon franchise has been no stranger to its fans making up terms when describing certain groups within the series. From shinies to Pika clones, these terms can go back generations. Today, we'll be focusing on the one group consisting of only 10, technically 11, Pokemon, as we'll be discussing Pseudo Legendries. More specifically, we'll be looking into details around those in Generation 3, as the Hoenn games didn't just give us one Pseudo Legendary, but two instead, which is something that no other generation has done before or ever since. Therefore, for today's performance, I want to answer the question, what would every Pokemon region's second Pseudo Legendary be? To begin with, let's discuss what is considered to be a Pseudo and how I'll be categorizing my choices throughout this video. Pseudo Legendaries themselves are Pokemon that share these three traits with one another. They are the final evolution of a 3-staged line, they have a base stat total of 600, and finally they have a slow rate of EXP growth, requiring 1,250,000 experience points to reach level 100. For the second Pseudo that I'll be adding, I'll be using official Pokemon found within each game's respective regional Pokédex. Then, I will boost their stats so that they are aligned with the needed 600 to become a Pseudo Legendary. Any form of evolution will also be permitted when I select my options. While at first I was concerned that I would be restricted to Pokemon that can only evolve by level up alone, I remembered that both forms of Goodra actually evolve by weather condition, plus level up. Now, while I should have added the criteria that level up should be at least one requirement for my selected option, this would actually restrict me to such an extent that some regions would be impossible to actually give a second, third stage Pseudo Legendary Pokemon to. As such, I will be allowing any form of gimmick evolution. My option for each region's second Pseudo will be dropped into one of three boxes. The main selection, which consists of Pokemon that I believe best work as that region's second Pseudo Legendary, when we make the adjustments to fit in with the three traits mentioned prior. Secondary options. This group consists of Pokemon that would also make for good Pseudos, but just missed the mark when compared to my main selection. And finally, honourable mentions. These Pokemon will be those that would make for fantastic choices, however, do not have the right number of stages required to become Pseudo Legendaries. This category will consist of Pokemon with single or two-stage evolutions. With that said, let's head over to the Kanto region to start things off. Scanning the Pokédex for Generation 1, I was surprised by the large amount of 3-stage lines to pick from. However, I made the decision early on to cut out many of the repeating tropes we see across the franchise. This includes the early birds, bugs, and normal type lines. The next issue I came across is that many Pokemon with 3 stages in Generation 1 tend to have a mirroring line. Think Nidoking and Nidoqueen, or if we're talking version exclusives, Victory Bell and Vileplume. I can't really give one Pokemon line the status of Pseudo Legendary while leaving the other with nothing. So I'll only be selecting from 3-stage Pokemon that are isolated to just their own lines. This leads us to our 4 possible candidates: Alakazam, Gengar, Machamp, and finally, Golem. While these 4 Pokemon do fall into the group of trade evolutions in Generation 1, I think that pulling one aside and letting the other 3 act as a trio is fair game. But, which one out of the 4 do I think would make for the best second Pseudo Legendary for Generation 1? Well, that would have to go to Golem. Now, I understand the outrage to that particular statement, as the other 3 have shown greater power and potential, being with their own Megas or even Gigantamax forms. However, the reason why I'm selecting Golem is down to the fact that the other 3 could become their own group within the franchise, just like how we have the Elemental Monkeys in Generation 5, which Game Freak designed with the theme of See No Evil, Hear No Evil, and Speak No Evil. My idea is to use the Psychic type Alakazam, the Fighting type Machamp, and the Ghost type Gengar to recontextualize these 3 into a set of Pokemon that represent the mind, the body, and the spirit. As Pokemon was founded off the idea of capturing, training, and trading Pokemon, I feel that already having a Pseudo Legendary like Dragonite, here to represent training a Pokemon up to reach its highest potential, while having an additional Pseudo Legendary to evolve via trading, in this case Golem, would perfectly showcase what the Pokemon games were originally asking for their players to do. So, with that, my selection for Kanto's second Pseudo would go to Golem. We would probably have to go and change where Geodude and Graveler would spawn though throughout the game so that the player doesn't end up with a Pseudo Legendary too early on. And while we have this ball rolling, let's move on to our honourable mentions for Kanto. Starting with Lapras. We have a Pokemon that is wildly popular and one that I could see having higher stats. It also works as we've seen prior Pseudo Legendaries being gifted away to the player, like when Steven Stone generously hands us a Beldum after beating the Elite Four. Arcanine's stoic design and Pokédex entry could also lead it to being a great choice, allowing this Pokemon to be one step closer to reaching its apparent legendary status, according to said Pokédex. Sadly, its role as a version exclusive to the mirroring line of Ninetales keeps it in this category. Of course, we have to also bring up Gyarados, which would make for an excellent option as a Pseudo Legendary, as this Pokemon is both the definition of raw power, but also shows the story of how something small and weak, like Magikarp, can grow into something fearsome and powerful, which is something that we see throughout many of the canonical Pseudo Legendaries. All our honourable mentions so far sadly lack the right number of stages that are needed to be considered Pseudo Legendaries. Just like our last honourable mention, Snorlax, a Pokemon so formidable it's the only Pokemon in-game to be physically able to stop the player on their journey. Well, until Sudowoodo would show up next generation. Speaking of which, on to the Johto region. Now my main pick may once again have some viewers swimming in the Lake of Rage, as its line isn't exclusive to the Johto region, with my option for Generation 2's second Pseudo Legendary going to Kingdra. As currently, I find that this Pokemon feels somewhat mediocre when compared to other Dragon types. So the additional 60 base stat total it would gain, if it became a Pseudo Legendary, would certainly give it that extra oomph that I think that this Pokemon needs. I'm sure Claire would also appreciate the extra power going to her ace Pokemon. As for why I selected Kingdra, my main reason is that the Johto Pokédex has incredibly slim pickings when it comes to pure Johto Pokemon with 3 stages. If we exclude Tyranitar and the starters from our choices, then all we are left with are Ampharos and Jumpluff. So I guess both of these Pokemon would be considered our secondary choices. For our Johto honourable mentions, I would choose Steelix and Scizor. With the Steel type being one of the newly added types in Generation 2, having a Pseudo with this new typing could better show off its power to the player. However, my main reason for them landing in this category, apart from both of them only having 2 stages in their lines, is that once again we have 2 Pokemon which are part of a mirroring pair. If one of these was to be turned into a Pseudo Legendary, then it would be unlikely that the other would ever gain any sort of popularity, with all the fans running to the one with better stats and a fancier title. But while those two couldn't show off what a Steel type Pseudo could look like, the following generation would do so greatly, with Generation 3 and the Hoenn games being the basis for this video, giving us the 2 Pseudo Legendaries, Metagross and Salamance. I won't spend too much time on this generation. Instead, I will do a quick run through of which honourable mentions I believe could have made for decent replacements. Slacking will be an interesting place to start, as we would need to decrease this Pokemon's stat down by 70 points to match the other Pseudo Legendaries. To make up for this, I think that Slacking would need to have a new ability instead of Truant, and instead be given something like Thick Fat, Oblivious, or Pure Power if we want to go crazy. However, this would be taking away Slacking's main gimmick within the games, showing the player that a Pokemon is not only as good as their stats, but their ability as well. And as abilities were introduced in Generation 3, I think it's fine to leave Slacking as one of the best showcasings for this new feature. Gardevoir and Aggron are other powerhouses that we could see once again as Pseudo Legendaries thanks to their Mega Evolutions. Flygon would also be a clear option as the underdog Dragon type for this generation. This may also be my only chance to get a picture of what its stats could have looked like if it had that sweet base stat total of 600. But I wouldn't actually choose any of these Pokemon mentioned prior as my replacement for either Salamance or Metagross, because that spot would instead go to Milotic. As this Pokemon is as hard, if not even more difficult to obtain than most Pseudo Legendaries, with its prior evolution Phoebus only attainable in 6 tiles across one river on Route 119, followed up by spending hours increasing this Pokemon's beauty stat, not level, in order to have it to evolve. Milotic has also shown up many times on some of the most formidable teams across the franchise, so I don't think anyone would bat an eye if this Pokemon had the status of Pseudo Legendary. And now we'll jump into the Sinnoh region, and immediately we are faced with the issue that Diamond and Pearl only have 2 lines with 3 stages aside from Garchomp and the starters, these being Staraptor and Luxray. As these lines are very early encounters as well, I can't really bring myself to say that either of these Pokemon should be considered as Sinnoh's extra Pseudo Legendary. As for my actual honourable mentions, we start with the fan favourite Lucario, along with imposing Pokemon like Vespiquen and Drapion. All 3 I think could have made for interesting second choices, however sadly, once again they all lack the right amount of stages to make the cut. For my main selection however, we'll be borrowing from the same idea I had for Generation 2, as my choice is once again an old Pokemon that received a new evolution in this generation, Togekiss and Mamoswine. While there are many newly added 3rd stage Pokemon to pick from this generation, my reasoning as to why I narrowed it down to these 2 is similar to that of the other generations. I picked Togekiss out of the group as its pre-evolutions are seen not only as mascots for Generation 2, but were also popular within the anime as well. But between the 2, my main pick for Generation 4 wouldn't land with Togekiss and instead go to Mamoswine. My primary reason is that this is one of the few Pokemon in this group that evolves by level up. Granted, it does need to have access to Ancient Power in order to do so, but I did mention earlier that any form of evolution is allowed. Though I do feel that the closer we can get to the official form of pseudo-evolution, the better. The Unovan games will thankfully be one of the simplest generations to pick from, as if you were to ask me what the pseudo-legendary is for Generation 5, I would answer with Hydreigon. However, I would then always be immediately surprised when remembering that Haxorus therefore isn't, which is why it is my definitive choice for this generation's second pseudo-legendary. As Pokemon Black and White were originally designed as reboots for the first generation, we once again see a lot of great candidates for our honourable mentions. Excadrill would be a fantastic pseudo, as it's already an opposing steel type to fight against. Giving it some extra power would only make it feel that much harder to beat, but also that much greater to use. Volcarona would have been my absolute first choice for this generation if it had only one more additional form between Larvesta and itself, as many trainers originally believed that this Pokemon was legendary, with how it patiently waits for the player at the bottom of Relic Castle. Finally, I would also like to consider Darmanitan, as not only once again do we have a Pokemon with decent strength, but its unique ability of form changing would make it stand out when compared to the other pseudo-legendaries. Nonetheless, while Darmanitan couldn't make the cut as our form changing pseudo, my main selection for Pokemon X and Y would do so without contest. Aegislash. This Pokemon already had such an incredible showcasing in its debut generation, so much so that Game Freak would go and nerf this Pokemon's stats by 20 points in the following generation. So, one could only wonder how much terror this Pokemon would have brought if its original base stat total was that of 600, just like the rest of the pseudo-legendaries. As you can see, I wanted to keep its strongest stats similar to what they would be normally. This is so Aegislash doesn't reach higher levels of absurdity, so the still increase of 1 point to these stats is just me making a minor reference to the original Pokemon games having 151 Pokemon. Otherwise, the additional 58 points would be divided almost equally across the rest of Aegislash's stats. Lastly, our only honourable mention for this generation would have to go to Noivern. As a 2-stage dragon Pokemon, it sadly missed the chance to get ahead of Aegislash. Now onto the hardest generation for potential second Pseudo Legendaries, as Pokemon Sun and Moon fall victim to many of the issues that plagued prior generations, as once again we enter a region where, excluding the starters and the original Pseudo line, we are only left with 3 new lines. As these selections don't really call out to me as potential candidates, I will once again be looking at Pokemon that don't fully originate from this generation. Using the newly added feature of regional variants, I could select Pokemon that had gained a variant across their whole line. For example, Alolan Golem or Alolan Muck. However, I believe that the most fitting selection for our second Pseudo Legendary would instead go to a Pokemon that only gained its regional form in its final stage of evolution. Alolan Raichu. My 2 main points are as followed. The first being this Pokemon's typing. While not as fearsome as it once was, the Psychic type was quite threatening back in early Pokemon games. So much so that Lugia, a Pokemon known as the Guardian of the Ocean, isn't Water type, but instead Psychic. It was quoted by Shigeki Miyamoto in an interview with Nintendo Dream that Lugia was made a Psychic type instead of a Water type because they wanted to give it a more stronger impression. So, Alolan Raichu's sudden stat increase compared to its Cantonian counterpart could be a reference to how powerful a presence the Psychic type once had on the series. My second and final reasoning as to why I selected Alolan Raichu was due to its line's popularity. Ask anyone to name a Pokemon and they will most likely answer you with Pikachu. As the mascot for the franchise, I can't see why, if given the idea, they wouldn't want to give their icon a new and powerful form. Even when you consider that this is something they would do in later generations, with Pokemon Let's Go having a Pikachu full of unique moves when compared to its wild counterparts, then following this up with Pokemon Sword and Shield, allowing Pikachu to undergo Gigantamaxing. The only difference here is that I'm suggesting that we give this new powerful form to its final stage Raichu instead of Pikachu. Though this isn't the only way that the Pokemon franchise could have used Raichu to help increase their mascot's popularity even further. In fact, I made a whole video where I go over what if Pikachu evolved like Eevee, where I explored all 8 of the different Pikalutions that we could have ended up with, including some wonderful art to showcase them off perfectly, which you can find by clicking the link at the top of your screen. As for Pokemon that just missed the mark as Sun and Moon's second Pseudo Legendary, I think the obvious choice would go to Glyzopod. With such a threatening design, paired with a unique method of capturing its pre-evolution Wimpod, I feel that this Pokemon would have made for a fantastic Pseudo Legendary. Now entering the Galar region, I feel that the second Pseudo Legendary would have to go to Grimmsnarl. This Pokemon definitely has an imposing stature that many of the pre-existing pseudos also present. Being a core member of Marnie's team in later battles would also give this Pokemon a great spotlight for the player to see this Pokemon's power, possibly driving them to go out and find one of their own. However, if this Pokemon did become a pseudo, then Impidimp would have to become a much harder Pokemon to find out in the wild. So for Pokemon Sword and Shield, Grimmsnarl would certainly be my main candidate. Oh, yeah, right. Well, you see, I can't really say that. Oh, okay. I'll change it. Apologies, everyone. One of my stagehands has informed me that I was reading off the wrong script. As I was about to say, my main candidate for the Galar region would not actually be Grimmsnarl, but instead go to Mr. Rhyme. This choice isn't based on any member of the cast or crew's personal bias, but instead came down to the fact that the Mime Jr. line is well beloved and should receive stronger representation in the Pokemon franchise, and rather than using a fairy type as the counterpart to the many dragons plaguing the Pseudo Legendary category, we should instead use the alternative of Ice types. Now that we have that all cleared up, I would like to briefly talk about our honourable mention for the Galar region, Duraludon. Yet another dragon type left out of the running for the consideration as Pseudo Legendary. This Pokemon has a lot of impressive qualities that could make it a decent pseudo. However, these traits would only increase once it received its evolution in the following generation. Archelodon will be our first honourable mention for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. As some of you may already know, this Pokemon's stats don't actually need to be changed, unlike the rest of the Pokemon we've discussed prior, as they already have a base stat total of 600. However, this still doesn't make Archelodon an official pseudo-legendary, as their line only consists of 2 Pokemon and not 3. Though that does beg the question, if in Generation 10 Game Freak gave this line a 3rd stage, would Archelodon then be classified as a pseudo-legendary? And if so, for which region? Galar, as this is where the first member of its line was introduced? Paldea, as this is where Archelodon, the Pokemon to fit the role of the pseudo, or the following generation where this line would be completed? On to our main candidates for Paldea's second pseudo-legendary. The first that I would like to suggest would be Tinkaton. As one of the most popular Pokemon added in this generation, standing against these kaiju-like monsters with nothing but its hammer, I think would make for a rather funny contrast to the types of Pokemon we usually see up on the mantle of pseudo-legendary. However, as much as I like the idea of going with Tinkaton, Paldea already has 2 Pokemon that practically meet every requirement to becoming a pseudo-legendary. These 2 Pokemon being Kingambit and Annihilape. Both these Pokemon have a dominating design, which would help them fit in nicely along with the current pseudos already in this category. My main pick for this region's second pseudo-legendary would go to Kingambit. With the highest base stats total out of the 3, we already see how much power this Pokemon can dish out. With the extra 50 points that this Pokemon would receive if it was a pseudo, would mainly go into boosting its speed and defenses. And with that, we see what every region would look like if they had 2 pseudo-legendaries, just like Generation 3. Going down the list, we have Dragonite and Golem for Kanto, Tyranitar and Kingdra for Johto, Salamance and Metagross remain unchanged for Hoenn, Garchomp and Mamoswine sit in Sinnoh, Hydreigon and Haxorus for Unova, Goodra and Aegislash for Kalos, Komodo and Alolan Raichu for Alola, Dragapult and Grimmsnarl for Galar, and finally, Baxcalibur and Kingambit for the Paldean region. If you skipped to this part of the video, and you're perplexed over my choices, then I would highly recommend going through the timestamp below and heading back to the region you're most confused about regarding my final selection. However, if you have any alterations or questions to what you believe should be each region's second pseudo-legendary, then feel free to let me know in the comments below. Until next time everyone, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the show.
Well, sorry, but I don't understand. I can't seriously say Mr. Rhyme as my final selection, I'm sorry.